The studio lights were bright, but the tension in the room was brighter. Even before the cameras went live, producers whispered into headsets, sensing this would not be a routine segment. Karoline Levitt sat upright, composed, her expression calm but alert. Across from her was Rachel Maddow, seasoned, confident, and clearly in control of the format she had mastered for years. On paper, it was just another interview. In reality, it was a collision waiting to happen. The opening music faded. Maddow welcomed viewers with practiced ease, framing the discussion as an examination of facts and accountability. Her first question arrived smoothly, wrapped in careful language that sounded neutral but carried a sharp edge. She stacked claims one on top of another, references to unnamed experts, selective quotes, and conclusions presented as settled truth. The rhythm was familiar: talk fast, control the narrative, leave little room to interrupt. Karoline didn't rush to respond. She didn't glance at notes or shift in her chair. She listened closely. Each sentence, each clause, each assumption was registered. To viewers, it may have looked like patience. To those in the studio, it felt like restraint. Maddow continued, building momentum until she reached a critical point. Mid-sentence, she said, and the agency knew this ahead of time. Karoline leaned forward slightly. It was subtle, but the camera caught it. Hold on, Karoline said evenly. Can you repeat that last part? The room went quiet. Maddow paused momentarily, thrown off rhythm. This wasn't an emotional outburst or a defensive dodge. It was a precise request. Maddow smiled faintly, attempting to restate the point with softer wording, already steering away from the exact phrasing she had just used. Karoline didn't let it slide. No, she said, still calm. Read it the way you said it. There it was. The shift. The interview was no longer moving forward on Maddow's script. The control she usually held effortlessly was suddenly contested. Maddow adjusted in her chair, buying time, reframing, trying to keep the segment on her terms, but Karoline had already made her move. She wasn't here to argue opinions. She was here to lock in words. And in that brief pause, before anyone realized what was happening, the balance of the conversation changed. The cameras kept rolling, and for the first time that night, it was Maddow who hesitated. The hesitation didn't last long, but it was enough. In live television, a single pause can feel like an eternity. Rachel Maddow recovered quickly, her professional instincts kicking in as she offered a revised version of her statement, shorter, vaguer, safer. It was the kind of adjustment viewers rarely notice, but producers rely on to keep control of a segment. Karoline noticed. That's not what you said, Karoline Levitt replied, her tone steady, almost conversational. You said the agency knew this ahead of time. Those were your words. Maddow smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. She tried to move on, pivoting toward a follow-up question, but Karoline didn't raise her voice or interrupt. She simply waited until Maddow finished, and then spoke with deliberate clarity. If we're going to talk about facts, Karoline said, we should be exact about them. The producers exchanged glances behind the cameras. This wasn't escalating into a shouting match, which would have been easier to manage. It was turning into something far more dangerous, a methodical dismantling. Maddow attempted to reassert control by invoking authority, reports, analysts, past coverage. She referenced documents without naming them, conclusions without showing how they were reached. To the casual viewer, it sounded airtight. To anyone paying close attention, it sounded incomplete. Karoline nodded as Maddow spoke, as if agreeing, even encouraging her to continue. When Maddow finished, Karoline reached down and lifted a single sheet of paper from the table. Can I read something? Karoline asked. Maddow hesitated again. We're limited on time, she replied quickly. It'll take 10 seconds, Karoline said. And it's directly related. Reluctantly, Maddow agreed. Karoline didn't rush. She read slowly, carefully, making sure every word landed. It wasn't commentary. It wasn't spin. It was a direct quote from the same agency Maddow had referenced, stating clearly that the information in question was not known at the time. Maddow had claimed. The studio felt tighter, smaller. Maddow leaned back slightly, her posture shifting from assertive to guarded. That document, Maddow said, has been disputed. By who? Karoline asked immediately. Maddow started to answer, then stopped. She named a group, then amended it to several experts, then broadened it to ongoing analysis. Each revision sounded less solid than the last. Karoline didn't press emotionally. She pressed logically. So just to be clear, she said, you stated as fact something your own sources say is disputed. And now you're asking the audience to treat that as settled. The words weren't accusatory, they were surgical. Maddow glanced briefly toward the producer's booth, then back at Karoline. The audience at home could sense the shift. This wasn't about ideology anymore, it was about credibility. Maddow tried to regain footing by reframing Karoline's response as deflection. Karoline didn't react defensively. She simply leaned in again. I'm not deflecting, she said. I'm clarifying. There's a difference. Another pause, another beat of silence heavier than the last. For the first time in the segment, Maddow stopped asking questions and started explaining herself. And in live television, that's when the power dynamic flips. Karoline sat back, hands folded, letting Maddow talk. She didn't need to interrupt anymore, the words were doing the work. By the time Maddow finished, the tone of the interview had changed completely. What was meant to be a controlled confrontation had become an open examination, one Maddow hadn't planned to be part of, and the audience could feel it. When the segment cut to a brief commercial tease, the energy in the studio shifted. Lights stayed hot, cameras repositioned, and producers leaned forward in their chairs. Everyone knew what had just happened, even if no one said it out loud. The interview had slipped off its rails. When the broadcast returned, the tone was supposed to reset. It didn't. Maddow came back smiling, but it was a controlled smile, now measured and tight. She opened with a transitional line, designed to steer the conversation back to familiar ground, broader implications, public perception, narrative framing. It was television muscle memory. Karoline didn't interrupt. She didn't smirk. She didn't rush. She waited. Maddow spoke for nearly a full minute, layering context on top of context, summarizing arguments rather than making them. To most viewers, it sounded authoritative. To anyone listening carefully, it sounded like distance, someone trying to move away from a specific claim without acknowledging it. When Maddow finally paused, Karoline leaned forward slightly. You keep saying the broader picture, she said calmly. But the broader picture is built on specific facts, and that's where this started. Maddow blinked once, and I think we've addressed that. Not exactly, Karoline replied. You adjusted it. That's different. The words landed harder than a raised voice ever could. Maddow tried to reframe again, suggesting Karoline was focusing on semantics. Karoline didn't argue. She asked a question, simple, direct, unavoidable. Would you say the same thing if the roles were reversed? Maddow hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but it showed. Karoline continued, her tone still even. If I came on your show and stated something as fact and you had a document contradicting me, would you call that semantics, or would you call it correction? The studio was silent except for the faint hum of equipment. Maddow exhaled softly and tried to reclaim momentum. This isn't about me, she said. It's about accountability. That's exactly why it matters, Karoline replied. Accountability applies to everyone in the conversation, especially the person holding the microphone. That line changed everything. From that point on, Maddow wasn't interviewing anymore, she was responding. Each follow-up sounded more defensive, more explanatory. She cited intent, interpretation, the pace of breaking news. Karoline didn't challenge those ideas directly. She let them stack up, then dismantled them one by one. Intent doesn't change accuracy, she said. Interpretation doesn't override original wording, and speed doesn't excuse certainty. Maddow attempted a final pivot, suggesting the debate itself proved the complexity of the issue. Karoline nodded once. Complexity is real, she agreed. But complexity isn't a license to say something that isn't true and move on. For the first time, Maddow didn't immediately reply. The camera cut to a wider shot. The audience at home could feel it now. This wasn't a clash of opinions anymore, it was a moment of exposure. Not loud, not theatrical, but precise. And precision is dangerous on live television. Karoline leaned back in her chair again, composed, waiting. The silence did the rest. It didn't last long, but it lingered in a way that made everyone uneasy. Rachel Maddow broke it with a measured laugh, the kind used to smooth over moments that refused to be smoothed. Let's not pretend, she said, that this conversation exists in a vacuum. Karoline nodded slowly. I'm not pretending that at all. I'm saying the vacuum appears when accountability disappears. That was the line producers later replayed in their heads. Maddow leaned into her chair, shifting from interviewer to commentator, trying to widen the lens again. She spoke about responsibility in media, about narratives forming faster than facts, about the pressure of influence. It was polished, familiar, safe. Karoline waited until Maddow finished. Then she spoke, not louder, not sharper, but clearer. You're describing pressure, Karoline said. I'm talking about choice. Maddow raised an eyebrow. And you think this was a choice? Yes, Karoline replied without hesitation. Every word spoken on air is. The exchange tightened. Maddow suggested that certainty can evolve as information develops. Karoline agreed, but with conditions. Evolving information requires correction, she said. What we didn't see was a correction. We saw a replacement. Maddow tried to counter by citing context again, emphasizing audience understanding. Karoline didn't challenge the audience's intelligence. She defended it. Viewers don't need things simplified, she said. They need them stated honestly. That sentence landed quietly and stayed. Maddow pressed, asking whether Karoline believed journalists should hesitate before making claims. Karoline answered instantly. I think journalists should pause before stating conclusions as facts. She said, especially when those conclusions shape public trust. The conversation had fully flipped. Maddow was explaining her process. Karoline was evaluating it. Cameras caught Maddow glancing briefly off-screen, perhaps at a producer or a monitor. Subtle, but noticeable. Karoline didn't comment. She leaned forward again. This isn't personal, she said, but it is professional, and professionalism means owning words when they're challenged. Maddow opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. When she finally spoke, her tone had changed, less assertive, more careful. Well, she said, we'll have to agree to disagree. Karoline smiled, not triumphantly, not smugly, just knowingly. That works, she said. As long as we're disagreeing on opinions, not on what was actually said. The camera cut to Maddow as the control room prepared to move on. The segment was nearing its end, but something irreversible had already happened. The conversation hadn't ended in chaos or shouting, it had ended in clarity. And clarity on live television is the hardest thing to outrun. As the clock ticked down, Maddow tried to accelerate the pace, one of the oldest tricks in live TV. If time becomes the enemy, precision becomes harder. She leaned forward, voice brisk, questions tighter, delivered like a rapid-fire sequence meant to keep Karoline reacting instead of steering. Karoline didn't bite. Maddow fired off a new point, then another, then another. Each one framed as if the previous exchange hadn't happened. She invoked reporting, sources, public record, and broader implications, stacking them into a wall of momentum meant to feel unstoppable. Karoline listened through the whole sequence without interrupting. When Maddow finally paused for breath, Karoline responded with the same calm. She'd kept all night. You're doing something right now that you criticized other people for doing, she said. Maddow's eyes narrowed slightly. And what would that be? Using speed to replace clarity, Karoline answered. The studio seemed to tighten again. Maddow tried to dismiss it as a debating style. Karoline didn't call it a style, she called it a tactic. I'm not accusing you of being malicious, Karoline said. I'm saying the audience deserves more than an edited version of the truth delivered at a faster rate. Maddow's smile returned, controlled. We're live, she said. That's how television works. Karoline nodded. Exactly. And that's why words matter even more. Maddow attempted to pivot to motives, implying Karoline's challenge was part of a political strategy, an attempt to undermine media credibility. It was a strong angle, designed to put Karoline on the defensive. But Karoline didn't defend herself. She reframed the entire premise with one question. Do you believe the audience is capable of hearing a correction? Maddow paused. Of course. Then why avoid one? Karoline asked. A beat, a long one. The tension in Maddow's posture shifted. She began speaking about editorial judgment. Karoline listened as Maddow spoke about uncertainty and interpretation. Her words were careful, but the explanation sounded like a justification, and audiences can smell justification. Karoline let Maddow finish, then placed both hands lightly on the table. I'm not asking you to agree with me, she said. I'm asking you to respect the standard you demand from everyone else. The camera cut to a wider shot. The studio. Audience small, invited. Quiet, didn't clap, but the reaction was palpable. That collective silent recognition when someone has made a point to clean to dodge. Maddow glanced down at her notes, then back up, and for the first time all night, spoke more softly. I think what you're doing is performing, she said. Karoline didn't flinch, No, she replied. I'm documenting. That single word hit harder than anything else she'd said. The countdown clock was dangerously low. Maddow tried to close the segment with a neutral line, to move forward, but the air in the room refused to normalize. Karoline had shifted the frame from debate to record, and once something is on the record, it doesn't vanish when the camera cuts. The producer's voice crackled faintly through Maddow's earpiece, urging a clean transition. The show needed to move on. The problem was, the conversation no longer belonged to the rundown. Maddow straightened her papers and attempted a reset. Let's take a step back, she said, tone neutral, almost conciliatory. People at home want clarity, not sparring. Karoline met her gaze. Clarity is exactly why this matters. Maddow tried to summarize carefully, selectively framing the exchange as a disagreement over framing rather than facts. It was a subtle move, meant to compress the exchange into something manageable. Karoline didn't allow it. That summary leaves something out, she said. The original claim. Maddow sighed, barely audible. We've covered that. No, Karoline replied. We circled it. The distinction was sharp and uncomfortable. Maddow shifted again, invoking journalistic norms, deadlines, and the realities of live broadcasting. Karoline acknowledged all of it without conceding ground. Those pressures are real, she said. So is responsibility. They exist at the same time. The camera cut briefly to a reaction shot, then back. Maddow's posture remained composed, but the rhythm was gone. Each follow-up now sounded like damage control rather than inquiry. With time running, Maddow posed one last question, less a question than a closing statement, suggesting debates like this ultimately come down to trust. Karoline nodded. They do, she said. And trust is built when people see corrections happen in real time. Maddow looked toward the camera, preparing to end the segment. Karoline added one final sentence, not loud, not dramatic. You don't lose credibility by correcting the record, she said. You lose it by refusing to. The studio lights dimmed slightly as transition music began. Maddow thanked her guest professionally. Karoline returned the thanks and stood. As the cameras pulled back, the room exhaled. But the moment didn't disappear. What lingered wasn't confrontation, it was the record. Once the cameras cut, the tension didn't dissolve. It changed shape. Staffers moved quickly, pretending everything was normal, but the air still carried the weight of what had just happened. Maddow removed her earpiece and exhaled, expression neutral but tight. Karoline remained calm, gathering her notes with the same deliberate pace she'd kept on camera. A producer approached Maddow, speaking in a low voice. Karoline couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. The body language said enough. This wasn't about timing or pacing anymore, it was about fallout. Maddow turned toward Karoline with a polite nod. Good discussion, she said, professional to the end. Karoline nodded back. Important. They shook hands, brief, correct, unmistakably final. As Karoline walked down the narrow hallway toward the exit, a staffer caught up to her. That's going to get clipped, he said quietly, just stating a fact. Karoline smiled faintly. That's fine, she replied. It already exists. By the time she reached the lobby, phones were lighting up, texts, alerts, screenshots. Someone had already pulled the moment, the pause, the question, the line about corrections, and posted it online. Another account slowed it down. Another added captions. Back in the control room, producers replayed the segment, not to admire it, but to assess it. The exchange didn't look chaotic. It didn't look combative. It looked controlled, and that made it harder to dismiss. Maddow watched one replay in silence. The moment where she hesitated just for a beat stood out more than anything else, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Karoline, meanwhile, stepped outside into the night air. She checked her phone once, then slipped it into her pocket. She didn't need to read the reactions yet. She already knew what would travel, not outrage, not spectacle. A single question asked calmly, one that couldn't be honest. And once a question like that is out there, it doesn't belong to the studio anymore. By the next morning, the clip had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't trending because of outrage or theatrics. It was trending because of stillness. Viewers shared the same 10-second stretch, the pause, the look, the moment where the conversation stopped being guided and started being examined. Commentators tried to frame it in predictable ways. Some called it a media ambush. Others labeled it a gotcha moment. But neither label stuck, because the exchange didn't feel like an attack. It felt like exposure. That night, on her show, Rachel Maddow opened with a different tone. She addressed the previous segment briefly, carefully, acknowledging that discussions evolve and that public conversations benefit from scrutiny. It was measured, professional, and intentionally broad. There was no replay of the moment online, and that omission only amplified interest. Karoline watched none of it. She spent the day in meetings. Questions that had nothing to do with television. But everywhere she went, someone brought it up, not with excitement, but with curiosity. "You didn't raise your voice," one person said. "You didn't interrupt," said another. "You just waited." That observation mattered more than praise. Late that afternoon, a reporter asked Karoline whether she had planned the exchange. She shook her head. "I planned to tell the truth clearly," she said. "What happened after that wasn't up to me." That answer circulated almost as widely as the original clip. Back at the network, editorial teams debated how to contextualize moments like that without legitimizing them further. The conclusion was uncomfortable. The moment didn't need context. It stood on its own. Because nothing unsettles a controlled narrative like calm resistance, and nothing travels faster than a moment where someone refuses to move on before the record is set straight. By the end of the week, the conversation had shifted beyond the clip itself. People weren't arguing about who won the exchange, they were arguing about why it felt different. Analysts on both sides tried to explain it away. Some called it a rhetorical tactic, others dismissed it as selective editing. But those explanations never quite landed, because viewers remembered how it felt watching it live. There was no ambush, no shouting, no clever insult designed for applause. There was just a moment where one person asked for accountability and refused to move past the answer. That distinction mattered. Media critics began revisiting the segment in long-form breakdowns, pausing at Karoline's phrasing, at Maddow's response, at the silence in between. The most replayed part wasn't the challenge, it was the hesitation that followed it. In interviews afterward, Maddow declined to discuss the exchange directly. She spoke instead about the importance of ongoing dialogue, about the dangers of oversimplification. It was a familiar framework, and it kept the conversation abstract. Karoline did the opposite. When asked about it, she kept returning to specifics. "There was a statement," she said. "There was a document. The rest is interpretation." That clarity frustrated critics who wanted spectacle. It also disarmed them. Even people who disagreed with Karoline's broader views admitted something unusual had happened. The exchange didn't escalate, it crystallized. Producers across networks quietly took notes. Not to recreate the moment, but to avoid it. Calm confrontation was harder to control than heated debate. And for viewers, the lesson was simple. You don't always need to overpower the narrative. Sometimes you just stop letting it rush past the truth. And once the pace slows, everything becomes visible. The story didn't end with a rebuttal or a retraction. It ended with a shift. Weeks later, the clip was still circulating, not because it was being pushed, but because people kept finding it on their own. It showed up in classrooms, media workshops, and long-form podcasts, dissecting modern journalism not as a viral moment, but as a reference point. What made it last wasn't confrontation, it was composure. Karoline was asked again and again whether she'd consider returning to the show. Each time she gave the same answer: if the conversation is honest, always. Rachel Maddow never revisited the exchange directly. She didn't need to. The moment had already entered a different category, one where denial only made it louder. Interviews grew more careful. Viewers noticed the change, even if they couldn't name it. Behind the scenes, producers quietly adjusted their formats. Questions became narrower. Claims were hedged more carefully. Corrections, when needed, came faster. The industry didn't announce a lesson learned, it absorbed one. Karoline moved on to other issues, other debates. She didn't reference the clip unless asked. When she did, she kept it simple. "I didn't try to trap anyone," she said once. "I just didn't let the moment move on without clarity." That line resonated because it was replicable. Anyone could slow a conversation down and ask for precision. The exchange didn't prove one side right and the other wrong. It did something rarer. It reminded people that authority isn't volume, and credibility isn't speed. In a media landscape trained to sprint past discomfort, someone had stood still long enough to make the truth visible. And once viewers saw it was possible, once they realized silence could be more powerful than interruption, the standard quietly changed. Not overnight, not everywhere, but enough to matter, because sometimes the most disruptive thing you can do on live television isn't to raise your voice, it's to calmly insist that words mean what they say.